PATA, which stands for Parallel Advanced Technology Attachment, is the old school hard drives. And I mentioned this just for the sake of us knowing some history about hard drives. And chances are that you actually have these hard drives in your systems now, either at home, and also at work, and even in your laptops, if you guys are using laptops, as well. But PATA drives are old school, recognized as 40-pin, a 40-pin ribbon cable. In here on the graphic, we have a pin that's red, at least the color red, and that basically signifies where pin 1 is. And if we're plugging this to another drive or to a motherboard, right, or a system board, we would need to know where pin 1 starts. So that way we're putting in the cable, properly. So anyway, these old school drives like PATA, they you can never have more than 2 connected per controller. So what's on the motherboard itself is considered the controller, and on the cable you have two interfaces. So you can connect up to 2 devices. So one device can be an optical drive like a CD-ROM or DVD, and then the other is a hard drive. Or you can have 2 hard drives, or you can have 2 DVD drives, right? Sometimes people have like a DVD writer, and sometimes they may have a DVD that's only read only, right? All it does is play, but it doesn't record, right? So on most systems, you would have 2 IDE controllers, and therefore you can have up to 4 hard drives or 4 drives connected at any given time. And this is with PATA technology. And the old school PATA technology has jumper settings, one for a master, slave, and cable select. So master and slave only meant that if a drive was considered a master, that means it was bootable. That's where the operating system was located. So it had to, you actually had to manually put in a jumper setting to say this is the master drive and this is the slave drive, meaning I'm just using this as secondary storage, or maybe I'm just using this as a CD or a DVD. And cable select would allow the cable to be able to select which one was the master drive. And as the operating system started getting smarter, it started to recognize that the drive that had the operating system, that was the one that the cable was going to select. So that was going to be considered the master. As far as the way it looks, this is a drawing of the inside of a hard drive. And this is, again, this is more the what was basically known as a mechanical drive, right? So we'll have a spindle, a platter, a head that actually does the reading, back and forth, on the hard drive itself. And then that's also known as the actuator, which is the motor that moves the head along the platter itself. So that's how it's able to read the drives, right? And it reads it by reading off these magnetic particles. So that's why, if you have a powerful magnet, chances are there's a possibility that you can erase the contents of the hard drive just with the use of a powerful magnet or it being near a magnet. The same goes for if you drop the drive, right? If you drop it because it actually has moving parts, right? Has a platter, a spindle, an arm, and even a motor in it, that if it just fell maybe 4 feet, that would probably be enough to damage the hard drive. But they're sold as SATA, which is basically the same type of mechanical hard drive, but what the difference is they've changed first of all, the transfer speeds are better, and also they're not using these 40-pin ribbon cables anymore. Now they're using a different technology, a different type of cable and pin set, even a different type of power cables. For these mechanical drives, the power cables look like this, and it actually known as a Molex connector, and they're 4 pins. And as you can see that, you know, from the 4 pins, 2 of them are considered the ground pins. And what ground pins do is they reduce the interference and they also improve the signal quality. So these are the more advanced SATA drives, right? There also are mechanical drives, but the difference is that the interface is no longer 40 pins. Now the data cable, instead of being 40 pins, now it's 7 pins. So 7 pins to be able to transfer data. And now instead of the power cable, right? In that case, in the case of the PATA drive, it was the Molex connector was 4 pins. So now for the SATA drive, it's 15 pins is the power connector. And I've just shown you this just for illustration purposes, so that way you guys can see what the pins represent, right? Mostly sending and receiving, or another way to say that is transmitting and receiving, which are listed as far as the functions, and then the ground, which again is used to reduce interference between the pins and also to improve on the signal quality. The newer technology for disk drives is SSD, or solid state drives. So remember how we had the spindle, the platter, as well as the actuator arm itself within the actual mechanical drives. Now with SSDs, now they're basically just chips, microchips, very similar to the same chips that we would have on our thumb drives, right? These USB thumb drives that we use, there are no moving parts whatsoever. So not having any moving parts gives it the ability to be less susceptible to physical shock. In other words, if you were to drop it, it wouldn't be that much of a big deal. Like, you're not worrying about, destroying the arm or the motor or the platter or the spindle from a mechanical drive. I mean, there's a possibility, you might damage it, if it hits a corner or it breaks, or it physically breaks, from the shell or something. But for the most part, it is pretty good in regards to shock, right? And another way to say shock is just dropping, right? So you can drop it, 4 to 6 feet, and technically it should still work. The same way I'm sure you guys have dropped thumb drives, and dropping a thumb drive doesn't really affect, its use. So SSD drives do have, better shock than their mechanical counterparts. The other thing is that they're quiet, right? Because there are no moving parts, nothing is spinning. You don't have those same sounds that you normally would have. As soon as you turn on the computer, what's making sound in your computer, other than like the fan, of course, right? Other than the fan, what's making the sounds is your hard drive spinning up. So if you can separate the sounds from your fan, you can actually tell that it's your hard drive that's making, sounds when it's being accessed or stuff is being saved to it. The solid state drive is also a lot faster than a mechanical drive, right? Because there's nothing, there's no arm that has to go back and forth to read these platters. Well, accessing the memory chips is a lot faster than the mechanical drives. It also uses the same type of technology that these mechanical drives use in terms of the interface. So it uses that SATA technology, right? Remember, the SATA technology was the 7-pin data cable and the 15-pin power cable, right? Those were the distinguishing factors from SATA and PATA. But SSD is slightly more expensive. It used to be, maybe about 6-7 years ago, the SSD drives used to be extremely expensive. Nowadays, they're just slightly more expensive than their mechanical counterparts. There's also another layer, and this is a software layer, and it's known as a flash translation layer. And all it is the interface between the flash drive and the operating system. And it's responsible for what's known as a garbage collection. When you're saving files on the SSD drive, you're not saving it magnetically the way you are with a mechanical drive. When you're dealing with SSD, SSD is using a different process, powering the cells within the microchips that are on the drive. Well, when it comes to SSD drives, if we took a hash value of the hard drive, then we powered off the computer. If the garbage collection process still hadn't finished, and we powered on the computer again, took a hash value, there's a possibility that the hash value will be different. And the reason it's different is because the garbage collection process hadn't completed yet. That's being used in SSD. So anyway, if you ever notice, like if you ever had if you had an old cell phone, let's say you had a cell phone that was more than 4 or 5 years, if you begin to realize that it starts to deteriorate in regards to how much data you can actually start storing, or maybe it starts failing, or programs stop loading, or whatever, it's because now the storage capacity is starting to get damaged. The problem with these cells, right, with these power cells, that the way it stores data, the cells have an actual shelf life. 2 or 3 years, they keep pushing out, a cell phone with greater capacity, more faster processor. You may see it as inexpensive disks also, right? Just in case. So I just want to make you guys aware of that. So what we're going to focus on are 3 levels of RAID. RAID 0, which is striping with no parity. Level 1, which is mirroring and duplexing. And level 5, which is striping with parity. And just so that way we're all on the same page, the operational definition of parity is a mathematical formula that reconstructs the data from failed drives using a RAID controller. And the way it does this is by solving for X if this was algebra, right? So let's say I had 3 hard drives. I know one is represented by 2, the other is represented by 5, and the one that failed is represented by X. I don't know what X is or what data was in there, was on that drive. However, if I treated it as an algebraic formula where I solve for X, right, 2 plus X equals 5. So what does X equal for you math majors?
3.
Yes, right, not a trick question, right, not a trick question. The same way you were able to solve for X in this example is the same way RAID level 5 is able to replicate data from a failed hard drive, because it's able to take the information from the other 2 drives, compute this parity, and be able to reproduce the data that's founded on that failed hard drive. RAID level 0 is striping with no parity, and it requires 2 or more hard drives, and it's used for improved performance, and there's no fault tolerance with it. So basically, if one hard drive fails, at this point, you really have to rely on restoring from backup if one hard drive fails. So the way this works is this board here is represented as a RAID controller. So this is a RAID controller or disk controller. This controller has 2 hard drives connected to it. In this case, I have hard drive 1 and this other hard drive 2. So one disk controller connecting to 2 hard drives. What this does is one file is spanned across both of these hard drives. So I don't know if you guys can see this, but you'll be able to see this when you look at your slide deck closely. Block 1 is on the left side, block 2 is on the right, block 3 on the left, block 4 on the right, block 5 on the left, block 6 on the right. So basically what it's doing is it's spanning one file onto both hard drives. Now, the beauty about this is, let's say I had one file and that one file was 6 blocks, right? Meaning it took up 6 blocks of data space within my hard drive. If this was one hard drive, it would just be one hard drive with blocks 1 through 6, right? 1 will be on the top, 6 will be at the bottom, right? So one hard drive, 1 through 6. In order for my hard drive to be read, it would have to go through all those blocks, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If you see here, that same file is also 6 blocks. However, because it's spanned across 2 hard drives, it now only has to go 3 levels deep, right? So, and it does this in parallel. So it reads blocks 1 and 2 at the same time, blocks 3 and 4 at the same time, blocks 5 and 6 at the same time. And keep in mind that this says requires 2 or more hard drives. If this was RAID level 0 and we had 3 hard drives, this would read it even faster, because what it would mean is that we would have another hard drive here with 1, 2, and 3, right? Or spread across 3 hard drives, and then 4, 5, 6. So basically, the first hard drive would have 1 and 4, right? Blocks 1 and 4. So it's reading it that much quicker. So instead of reading it, 6 blocks long if it was 1 hard drive, or 3 blocks long if it was 2 hard drives, because it's using 3 hard drives, it's reading it in 2 block increments. So that means it's reading the first, second, and third drive in parallel. And keep in mind that fault tolerance here means that if 1 hard drive fails, you have to restore from backup at that point. You cannot recover. If I had 3 hard drives on this, it's great that I have, very fast performance. But if 1 hard drive fails, it doesn't matter if I had 2 others that still had data on it, but because that data was spanned across all those disks, it basically renders, the entire contents of these hard drives useless. Therefore, I have to restore from backup. So this is where RAID level 1 mirroring and duplexing comes into play, where mirroring uses 1 disk controller and 2 hard disks. And what this has is whatever is on my first hard drive, I have that exactly the same way on the second hard drive. So on my first hard drive, I have blocks 1, 2, and 3. Therefore, I'm going to have my second hard drive the same thing, blocks 1, 2, and 3. Now, the advantage that this has is I do have a level of redundancy here. The redundancy is on the hard disk level. So meaning if 1 hard drive failed, that's okay. I still have this other hard drive that has exactly the same information, right? My mind is put at ease that I have exactly the same type of data that I had in the drive that failed. I do not have to restore from backup. I'm in a good position here because 1 hard disk fails, I have the same exact data on the other. The disadvantage of that is that I'm only using 50% of my total disk space, right? So let's say I had 1 terabyte hard drive on my left side, and then I had another 1 terabyte hard drive on the second. In total, I really have 2 terabytes, right, of total disk space. But because I'm using mirroring, I'm only utilizing 1 terabyte, right? So that's why I lose 50% of my total disk capacity. I really have 2 terabytes, but because this is an exact copy of the other, I'm only using the individual capacities of these hard drives. So advantage, I have a level of fault tolerance here, or another level of redundancy, where if 1 hard drive fails, I have an exact duplicate of it. Disadvantage is that I'm using only 50% of the disk space. Now move on to duplexing, almost the same exact scenario. Only difference is with duplexing, I don't only have redundancy on my hard disks, I also have redundancy on the disk controllers, right? I now have redundancy on the disk controller level, right? Going back to the mirroring example, if both my hard disks are good, but let's say my disk controller, it gets damaged, or something goes wrong with it, well, I now do not have access to my data because the disk controller failed. So this is where duplexing comes into play. Same exact scenario as mirroring, except I have that extra level of redundancy on the disk controller card. So if this controller card fails, that's okay. I got this controller card that's accessing this other hard disk, that has the same exact data that was on the other disk controller and also on the hard disk on that end. Exactly the same thing. And this too also gives you faster read transactions. So when mirroring a duplexing reads data, it is actually reading it in parallel. So it's reading it fast. So as it's reading block one on one end of it, it's reading block two on the other in parallel. So that way it is performing better in regards to reading transactions. So RAID level 5, striping with parity. This requires 3 or more drives and is used for improved performance as well as for tolerance. The data is spanned across all the drives. So if one drive fails, that's okay. It can automatically rebuild the data from that drive based on the parity, right? The same way we discussed what parity was before, that information can be rebuilt, right? The same way we were able to rebuild 2 plus x equals 5, right, through an algebraic expression. Parity is a little more complicated, but nonetheless, it's a mathematical formula that, based on the information from the other drives, it's able to rebuild the data of the drive that got damaged. So in this situation, we have one disk controller, or in this case, let's just call it a RAID controller, because that's essentially what it is, right? It's a RAID controller connecting to 3 hard drives. So one file is spanned across 3 hard disks. And going back on the same example where we had one file that was 6 blocks or took up 6 blocks of storage, if you look closely here, there are actually 9 blocks that are being used, 9 blocks. So we have block 1, block 2, parity, block 3, parity, block 4, parity, block 5, block 6. Drive 1 fails. That's okay, because what the RAID controller does is the RAID controller has its own processor. The same way there's a CPU, right? We have a central processing unit in our computers, right? It's basically like the brain of the computer. Well, this RAID controller also has its own processor. And what that processor does is it computes block 2 plus the parity, and it figures out what's the missing, what's the X from drive 1 that failed. And so it automatically, in this case, populates it with data that's found in block 1. Let's take another scenario. We got these disks, right? 1, 2, and 3. Let's say drive 2 fails. Same situation. We got the data in block 1, along with the parity on drive 3, able to reproduce the X. In this case, it'll be the data that's found in disk 2, right? So just one more example of that. Let's say it's disk 3 that fails. Disk 3 fails. We take the data that's in block 1, along with the data that's in block 2, compute the parity to figure out what the actual parity is for drive 3, right? Or whatever that X was. Same situation, take block 3 on disk 1, work out the parity that's found in disk 2 to compute the data that's missing in disk 3. So that's how this RAID controller, through the use of its processor, is able to regenerate that data specific for these disks. The way this works is the more drives that are used, the better disk utilization I have, right? So right now, as it stands with 3 hard disks, basically using 33% of the total disk space for parity, right? For that check, to make sure the stuff can be computed. If I threw on another hard drive there, it'll be 4 disks. Well, in that case, as I stated here in the last bullet, that means I would only utilize 25% for parity. If I have 5 disks, then that would mean it would be 20% would be utilized for parity. So the more disks I have, the better utilization, right? But in any of those scenarios, if one drive fails, that's okay, because that drive's data will automatically be regenerated based on the information from the other drives. RAID level 6 and 10, 6 is striving with double parity, which basically means it's similar to RAID 5, but the parity data are written to 2 drives. So basically, if I have the ability to have 2 drives failing, and I'll be able to recover from 2 drives, failing. So that's RAID level 6. RAID level 10, I'm combining the same characteristics of RAID level 1 and RAID level 0, right? So remember, RAID level 0, the advantage of RAID level 0 is the fact that it's very fast. And the advantage of RAID level 1 is the fact that you have mirroring, right? So with RAID level 0, if one drive failed, you basically have to restore from backup, right? You got no choice. But in a RAID level 10 configuration, if one drive fails, that's okay, because you have a whole set of drives that you've mirrored. You basically mirrored the drives, so everything's intact. The examples that we went over were specific hardware implementations. Okay, so there are software implementations of this through the operating system. Now, the difference is that instead of using a processor that's built into the RAID controller, we'll now be utilizing the CPU, the computer's central processing unit, to compute the parity if we were using RAID level 5 as an example. So in a software implementation of RAID level 5, you would get slower performance. If one of those drives have failed, you will know a drive failed. In a hardware implementation, you wouldn't know a hard drive failed in a hardware implementation, because the processing power from the RAID controller to the user would be unnoticed. That the only person that will really know would be like the administrators, the person that actually is running, that's administering the network or administering the server, and has to address, the hard drive that failed. But in those situations, normally that's on the back end, right? We say this is what the administrator would handle. The MIS shop or the IT shop, they would literally take the hard drive out that failed and pop in a new drive. And by popping in a new drive, the RAID controller will automatically regenerate all the data and parity that was designated for that particular drive, and it'll actually rebuild that hard drive. So now, once the hard drive is rebuilt, everything goes back to normal.